Hello, you've got Paula here, and I encourage you just to get settled for a little bit while I share some thoughts before we begin the presentation at the top of the hour. And so I'll just go through a few things here. Our last webinar was April 4th, and we had traditional naturopath Glenn Debke presenting on gut infections, the source of gut, brain, and immune issues. You know, what an excellent teacher Glenn is. It's really helpful information that he offered, and I hope you have a chance to check it out. It's up under archived webinars on our website. And another feature I want to make sure that you're aware of is our All About Alumni series. We get to talk to our graduates once a month where they're showcased one at a time, and they are going to be talking about their successes and as well as the challenges that they faced and learned from post-graduation. And it's also an opportunity for you to be able to talk directly to the grads and ask questions or pose a comment. These presentations air at noon Pacific time on the first Wednesday of each month. So tune in with us live on Wednesday, May 3rd for our next graduate. We've got Barbara Rogers with us. She's got a great journey to talk about. So we'll be having that. And yeah, we've recorded all of our webinars and the All About Alumni events too. And we'll record this one today as well, so you'll be able to access them from our website anytime. Just a reminder that we always offer you a survey to complete after the webinar ends, and it's your opportunity for you to give us feedback on this presentation. And I want to hear about what you'd like to learn more about in upcoming webinars too, so jot a note down about that. And one other thing here, the National Association of Nutrition Professionals, if you're not familiar with that organization, they're a powerful member-based organization just for holistic nutritionists in this country, well, worldwide now. And they're having their annual conference up in Portland, Oregon. It's from May 4th to the 7th. And the focus of it this year is blazing trails and holistic nutrition. Their board exam is being offered the day before. So there's that opportunity as well, and it's always a great conference. And you know, there'll be Hawthorn students and grads and some faculty there. So it's a good opportunity to be able to meet up and see what's happening in the industry and be together live. It's always a fun thing, and they've got really great food. So there's something to be said for that. All right, we have got a few minutes before we get to the top of the hour with our presenter Rosalee. And so I think I want to just take this opportunity for the two of us to talk a little bit and see what Rosalee's up to these days. So Rosalee, are you here?
I'm here.
Oh,
Hi,
great.
Paula.
Hi. Thanks for being with us again.
Such a pleasure.
I know. So I want to know what's new with you. What have you been up to?
Well, I think just after I presented for Hawthorn University last time, which was a while ago, I got a book deal with Hay House Publishing, and I spent a couple years writing a book, and that just published 2 weeks ago as of today. So the book is called Alchemy of Herbs, Transform Everyday Ingredients into Foods and Remedies that Heal. And it's been, it's been a really exciting 2 weeks. And even before that, kind of the pre-order phase was really big too. So it's been a lot of book promotion and getting out there, doing lots of presentations in my own community.
Fantastic. Well, bravo. It's a huge thing to accomplish, putting out your book. And I'm delighted that I got it on pre-order, so I have it in my hands. And yeah, I took it out of its wrapper and I opened it up and started thumbing through it and started drooling.
Yeah, I was really lucky to be able to do so many photos for the book, and it's kind of a combination of an herbal and a cookbook, and so it has photos like you would have in a cookbook with lots of pictures of recipes, and then it was really important for me to have a lot of pictures of the plants themselves too, because that's such a big part of what herbalism is for me, is connecting with nature. So I like to bring herbs out of the capsules or out of the tincture bottle and look at them in their natural habitat, so to speak.
Well, you bring that to life here in the book. And did you say you photographed? These are your photographs?
Most of them, yeah. I did end up having to get some stock photos, and a couple friends lent me some of their photos, but for the most part, it's mine.
Wow, even more impressive. Absolutely. No, I've got it open right now. I'm kind of stuck on this today. I haven't flipped past it. It's the turmeric and pumpkin seed paste.
Yes, that's a good one. I came up with that recipe entirely for the book and just wanting to have always trying to think of new ways to get turmeric in, enjoyable ways.
Sure. Well, I think that you have a very, very unique book here. I've not seen the combination of a book on herbs coupled with recipes, coupled with these kind of photographs, and all the lore and the background and the encouragement that you have in here, and in such a user-friendly format.
Well, thank you. I really wanted to make it inspiring and practical, and it was really my goal that someone would read, say, a chapter in the book about say turmeric, for example, or lemon balm or stinging nettle, which we'll be talking about in tonight's presentation. But whatever the chapter is, I wanted them to read it and think to themselves, wow, I didn't know that herb could do that. How do I get that in my life? And so then each chapter has all those recipes that are simple and practical so that people can just jump right in.
Yes, plus the encouragement to get outside and find them or plant them and grow them, to be able to collect and harvest and make the remedies. And so recipes is one thing. To be able to make remedies with them is beautiful.
Yeah, I really wanted to show the full spectrum of how we can incorporate herbs into our lives, whether it is for an enjoyable tea or for a healing meal, or if it is for actual remedies to address a specific health concern.
I understand you've got a companion program that you just launched with this too, a video series.
Yeah, that just launched today. When we scheduled this, like last fall, little did I know what an exciting day it's going to be. So we've been working on it for a year, but we released a video companion course to the book, so that it brings the book to life, and it takes people step by step through creating 15 herbal remedies, so they can have their own kitchen apothecary.
And I looked at them. I looked at the remedies that you're having people make, and it appeared to me that after making, you had such variety in them that after making them, people should have the confidence to do so many more things within the book.
Yeah, that's kind of so we didn't widely make this obvious, but basically each one of those different 15 recipes is a different herbal preparation. And so by the time people finish it, they don't only have an actual apothecary that they can use that they've made themselves, but they know how to make a tea versus a decoction versus a syrup versus an infused oil versus a salve, and on and on and on. So basically all the basic herbal preparations that an herbalist uses is in this course. So it's kind of this twofold, like the underlying teaching is teaching you how to make these things, but it ends up in this very practical result.
Well, brilliant. I think you've really got something here that people want very much, to be able to do hands-on, to be able to know how things are made, to be able to make things themselves. And I just wish you all the best with this.
No, thank you so much, Paula. It's been really fun, and the response has been really great too. So it's been fun to see people, like you said, kind of yes, all of that.
Yes, it feels really good once you've been pumping out this kind of work and attention on a project to get some very positive feedback. And so I want to know if you'd like to gift one of our attendees with a copy of this book that's attending the webinar today.
Yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic. So everybody, if you want to win a copy of this book, all you have to do is fill the survey out at the end and let me know that you're interested in the book. and we'll put you in a random drawing in the next couple days, and we'll let the winner know by email, and then we'll announce it at the next webinar as well. Sound good, Rosalee?
That sounds great. Thank you, Paula.
All right. Sounds great. Well, I think that brings us right up to the top of the hour. So if you're ready, I'm going to move into do a formal introduction and get you started.
Sounds great.
All right. Well, welcome to everybody to Hawthorn University's webinar series. I sure thank you for joining in. I'm Paula Bartholomew, and it's my pleasure to be the moderator today. I want to let you know we're going to save time at the end of Rosalee's presentation for your questions. So at any time during the presentation, and don't be shy, don't hold back, add your questions and comments to the webinar panel anytime, and then I'll pose them for each of you at the end. And I also want to encourage you to keep your eyes on the chat box too, because Alex consistently posts details there, so you don't need to write down URLs and things like that. She's always extremely helpful here. So Hawthorn University has the pleasure of welcoming back Rosalee de la Forêt today to give a presentation on holistic perspectives for insulin resistance. And in this presentation, Rosalee is going to share the many herbs and the lifestyle changes that a person can adopt to be able to significantly improve their health and reverse insulin resistance. This is huge because it's such an important topic and an approach to health. Since we're seeing over 35% of the US adult population have experienced insulin resistance or some type of diabetes, most notably type 2. So the chances are most of us know somebody that's affected by this metabolic syndrome. And Western medicine can manage this disease with medications, but a holistic approach can go much further in arresting or even reversing the condition. So I want to learn more about that with Rosalee. And just a little bit of background about Rosalee and how passionate she is about helping people discover the world of herbalism and natural health. Her teaching makes herbs simple and practical for everyone. She's the education director at LearningHerbs and is a registered herbalist with the American Herbalist Guild. As we've been talking about, Rosalee's the author of Alchemy of Herbs, Transforming Everyday Ingredients into Food and Remedies that Heal, as well as the online course Taste of Herbs, Herbal Cold Care, and Apothecary, and the new Alchemy of Herbs video companion that's just released today. So it's a pleasure to have you present again with us, Rosalee.
Well, thank you, and thank you for that introduction, Paula.
You're welcome. I know you've got a lot of really good information to share, so I'm going to be quiet now and give it to you.
All right, sounds great.
Okay.
Yeah, so we're going to be discussing the holistic approaches to insulin resistance. And there we go. So I'll give you an overview of what insulin resistance is, as well as type 2 diabetes, since they're very intricately connected. We'll talk briefly about holistic protocols, and I'm going to be very transparent in that I had kind of a tossing and turning last night, and I realized that I just wanted to do a completely different presentation than I had originally thought of. And the reason why is because the more I thought about it, is a lot of these holistic protocols, which I will go over briefly, are readily available out there, right? This is a major disease. It's very common, and there's a lot of information that you could really easily find out there. And so I didn't want to just replicate that same information that's found in so many different places. So what I'm going to spend the bulk of this webinar on is talking about how we can specifically use herbs for people who have insulin resistance and even type 2 diabetes, because I really think this is a significant missing piece of this puzzle, and this is the information that I don't see repeated over and over again in the widely available information. And I'm going to be looking at this from also a slightly different perspective, in that we certainly can use herbs to address these issues as they come up, but also thinking about that from a more holistic way of how we can actually use these herbs to prevent the illness in people who are already healthy, or prevent it from continuing on its progression. So insulin resistance, metabolic syndrome, syndrome X, those are all synonyms for the same thing. And type 2 diabetes is basically the end result of untreated insulin resistance. So they estimate that in general, certainly there's people on all ends of the spectrum, but in general, it takes about 10 years for someone who has insulin resistance to fully develop into type 2 diabetes if they don't take steps to correct it, of course. So insulin resistance diabetes is incredibly common in our society today. Estimating 25.8 million children and adults have type 2 diabetes. And it's one thing that's really interesting is that we have people who are diagnosed, and we have a significant amount of people who are undiagnosed. So they have these metabolic problems and they don't even know it. And then we have 86 million people who have pre-diabetes, which, as we'll see in this presentation, when people are in these beginning stages of this disease, it's really imperative that we take steps then to stop the progression of it. So what is it? Well, it's basically a metabolic condition that results in elevated blood sugar. And we'll look at the pathophysiology of it as well. But basically symptoms include an elevated blood sugar, which can mean a fasting blood sugar greater than 100. Obesity is often a symptom, but not always. There might be an increased waist to hip ratio. So basically the waist is larger than hips. Hyperlipidemia, and there can also frequently be impaired fertility. So women often might manifest as PCOS, and men have erectile dysfunction. So one thing that I have seen kind of repeated frequently is it's like people feel like they just woke up one day and they have type 2 diabetes. Like, oh, I got type 2 diabetes when I was 50. But as I've been already talking about, the idea is actually that the first seeds of this disease start way well in advance. And so I think it's more helpful to think of it on a range. So you might have somebody who has ideal blood sugar. Over time, maybe it takes many years, they have less than ideal blood sugar, and then that fully progresses on to type 2 diabetes. So no one wakes up with type 2 diabetes is what I'm trying to say. It takes time. And that's actually a very cool thing because that gives us a lot of time to address it. And even if somebody is already diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, there's also a lot of things we can still do. So I don't mean to make it sound like once you have it, that's the end of the world or anything. It's really something that can be addressed holistically on many different levels. So the pathophysiology of insulin resistance. So I'm going to kind of talk this out through words, and then I'm going to show you a graphic just to kind of show you exactly what I mean. So basically, we eat food. It's broken down into these smaller and smaller nutrients so that our body can utilize it, right? They're building blocks for our body. And many of the foods we eat are actually broken into glucose. So it's a type of sugar, and it's actually a main energy source for our body. So when things are going well, glucose is detected in the bloodstream. The pancreas releases insulin. Then insulin gets into the bloodstream and it attaches to cells, which then allows the glucose to be taken in by the cells. Then that glucose is then converted into energy. So when problems occur, it can be because cells become resistant to insulin. So if you can imagine, insulins, they can't open the cells. And so glucose then can't go into the cells. Then that glucose remains in the blood, which can lead to elevated glucose. So this is the idea of insulin resistance, right? The cells are resistant to the insulin. And we'll look at other factors too, but cells can also become resistant for a variety of reasons like sleep deprivation, stress, nutrient deficiencies. All right, here's this graphic here. And on the left-hand side, we have what kind of a normal function here. So we're looking at the bloodstream right here. If we look at our key up in the upper left here, we have glucose, insulin, insulin receptors. So we have glucose and insulin in the bloodstream. And here we see the insulin receptors on the cell, and we see insulin attaching there. Glucose can then enter the cell, be converted into energy. And so this is a healthy functioning system. What we have over here is you see a lot more glucose in the bloodstream. These insulin markers, they aren't able to attach into those insulin receptors, which means glucose can't go in the cell, results in higher glucose in the bloodstream. So when we have chronically high blood sugar, really what this leads to is a systemic inflammation, which really can harm the body in a lot of ways. We take a look at this tree here. We have insulin resistance as being this kind of root cause, but it's causing all this inflammation, which then leads to a lot of different diseases. At the top, we have type 2 diabetes, which is kind of the end result of insulin resistance. But really, there's a lot of other disease processes going on, from kidney disease, eye disease, heart disease, cancer, impaired cognition, and poor reproductive health. So, I would say that insulin resistance is easily the most common thing I see in my own clinical practice. But rarely does somebody come to, sometimes they do, but it's rare that someone comes to me and says, I have insulin resistance that I want to have addressed. They often come because of these other reasons, but what really is going on is this root cause of inflammation, which is often caused by insulin resistance. So how does this get diagnosed? Well, there's several different tests, and some of these you can do at home, and some need to be an official blood draw. So fasting blood glucose and post-meal blood glucose levels, those are two tests that can easily be done at home, and I'll talk a little bit more about those. Then there's hemoglobin A1C test, which basically is looking at blood glucose levels over a period of time. That needs to be done with a blood draw. And then fasting insulin levels also needs to be done with a blood draw. So this is a glucose meter, and these are readily available and absolutely imperative for anybody who's dealing with insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes. And they're actually fairly cheap to buy, and you can find them at any drugstore. If they're already on the path of insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes, then insurance might pay for them. So that could be something that they talk to their doctor. The devices themselves aren't too expensive. What is expensive can be expensive is the strips that are used to read the blood, because those just can add up over time, because especially when starting out, you'll need to test several times a day. So this is an important slide, and this, before I talk about the slide, it just reminds me to let everyone know that besides Hawthorn University recording this webinar that you can watch later, where you can pause it and see these things in more detail, but you can also be able to download the slides. So this is a really important slide with lots of information. I certainly don't expect you to memorize this now. It's something that's probably referred to over and over again. So this is basically looking at different tests, what it is in the normal range, what it is in the insulin resistant range, and what it is in the type 2 diabetes range. So fasting blood glucose, Western labs generally say less than 100 is the unit of measurement, but functional medicine and looking at things kind of more concisely would say you definitely want to be under 90. If you have insulin resistance, then you'd regularly have results between 100 and 125. And type 2 diabetes gets diagnosed when people are regularly above 126. So in a previous slide, I mentioned that 1 hour post-meal tests or postprandial tests actually tend to be more accurate than fasting blood glucose. And that's because there's a lot of things that can affect the fasting blood glucose levels. So what's ideal about this is it just gives us a more accurate perspective. What's not ideal is that sometimes it's hard for people, right, to remember, like, oh, I need to set the timer for an hour after I eat and then test it, but I do highly recommend it. So again, there's kind of two ranges here. Some Western labs generally say below 140 is okay, but I think 125 is better. Testing between 140 and 190 regularly might mean you have insulin resistance, and doctors diagnose type 2 diabetes when it's regularly over 190. Then the 2 hours, same deals. The 1 hour can be more accurate, but can be a little bit difficult to remember, but 120 and 100 is there. Greater than 120 is considered insulin resistant. So these are all important numbers to know, because what I recommend is that people who have insulin resistance is that they have that glucose meter and they're regularly testing their blood sugar to see where it's at. And as we'll see, diet, lifestyle, herbs, they can all have a dramatic effect on reducing these levels and getting them to a more ideal level. But the thing is, not everyone's the same. And so people will find that different diets work for them, different macronutrient ratios work for them, different herbs work for them. So it's important to have this, objective test that people can look at to see what exactly is working for them. Then the last one in there is hemoglobin A1C, and that's generally thought of as less than 5 is ideal. 5.7 to 6.5 is insulin resistant stage, and greater than 6.5 is considered in the realm of type 2 diabetes. So one last thing I'll say about this testing is that I mentioned before that this is one of the most common things that I see in my practice. And generally, as I mentioned, people don't come to see me for this reason, but what happens is I will look at their blood tests and I'll see fasting blood glucose is very common. It's on a standard metabolic panel, so it's generally always there. And I'll see somebody in their fasting blood glucose, let's just say is 105. And so I'll ask them, did your doctor happen to mention anything about your fasting blood glucose? I would say 30–50% of the time people say, no, they didn't mention it at all. And then 50% of the time or so, people will say, oh yeah, they did mention that. They said that we'll keep monitoring it every year, and then once it gets to a certain level, they'll give me medication to help control that better. So that's unfortunate, and because really, as I've mentioned before, we want to be addressing that now and not just waiting for the disease to progress. So it's a good idea to know these blood tests, very simple blood tests, and to keep an eye out for them. Of course, I'm an herbalist, I'm not a doctor, so I don't use them to diagnose. I don't tell people that they have this or that disease, but I do talk to them about improving insulin sensitivity levels. So, basically insulin resistance is really common. It's really undiagnosed. So I encourage periodic testing. If you see somebody who has, even that level of 105, then encourage that they get a glucose meter so that they can begin to look at how they can use diet, lifestyle, and herbs to keep that at a better level. Then people who are risk factors, if they're sedentary, overweight, maybe they have heart disease, like imbalanced cholesterol levels is a big sign, or even just above the age of 45, they're going to benefit from keeping an eye on this. So Western medicine, they just generally recommend an ADA diet, which is low-fat, high whole grain diet. Insulin might be administered daily, but that's pretty rare that that's used these days. More often, drugs like metformin, that's kind of the most common thing that's given today. If you are working with someone who has metformin, know that it's very hard on the liver, so using herbs to support the liver might be a good idea. And also that people on metformin have been shown to have a higher propensity to B12 deficiency. So I've cited a lot of different studies and articles in this presentation, and if I took the time to go over all the different clinical trials and explain them fully, I think one, you'd get really bored, and two, it would take a really long time. So what I've done is, and all of these slides, I've put links to them or cited them in some way so that if you're interested in seeing the science behind this, looking at those clinical trials, not just taking my word for it, then that information is there for you to do so. So this slide basically citing that B12 deficiency in people who are taking metformin. So in Western medicine, if you are diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, they say they can't cure it, but it certainly can be managed. People with diabetes generally live 10 years less than the average. They have a much higher increase in lower limb amputations, and they have a much higher increase in heart disease, liver disease, and kidney disease. So let's talk about holistic approaches to insulin resistance. So from a holistic perspective, we're looking at insulin resistance as a preventable disease that's often caused by poor diet and sedentary lifestyle. But there are many different things that can contribute to insulin resistance, like stress, sleep debt, some medications cause it. Genetics also play a role. So there's definitely people who are more susceptible than others, but in most cases it can be avoided. And if somebody is already on this pathway, it can also be reversed. So as holistic practitioners, we're always talking about the root of things. So with insulin resistance, as I've mentioned, here's some of those root causes: genetics, diet, sleep debt, excess alcohol, medications, stress, sedentary life, and a phytonutrient deficiency. So in my original thoughts for this presentation were to spend a lot of time talking about things like diet and sleep debt and stress and sedentary life. But again, I think that this crowd knows a lot about those things already. Plus, I think, again, that information is readily available out there. So I'm going to spend a lot of the presentation talking more specifically about phytonutrient deficiency. And as a result, we're going to talk about herbs to increase insulin sensitivity. We're going to talk about herbs that can help modulate inflammation. And under all of this is kind of this umbrella of herbs that protect against disease. So people who have type 2 diabetes, 75% of them are going to die from heart disease. So that's pretty staggering. And so from a holistic perspective, I think the more that we can do to support people's heart health is going to be important. Kidney disease is also a really big problem for people with type 2 diabetes, so let's protect their kidneys too. Also, many types of cancer are correlated to type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance, so let's do whatever we can to support against that as well. So in focusing on phytonutrient deficiency, I don't want to give this lopsided view of that I would only use herbs for people with insulin resistance, because these other root causes are really important too. So, and in fact, I would say I focus a lot on those and add in the phytonutrients, but I want to just briefly go over those because I feel like it would be a disservice to just completely ignore them. So first up, we're going to look at diet. So in considering a diet for insulin resistance, oftentimes it's going to be a low-carb diet that serves people well. Sometimes a ketogenic diet might even be necessary, so that's extremely low carb. What I focus on accentuating is leafy green veggies, healthy fats, and protein. So we're thinking of all whole food, nutrient-dense sources within those realms. And generally, we're avoiding sugars, grains, and root vegetables. And I put in there for some people because when I was talking about doing that glucose testing, it really does vary for people. So I've seen people who have some level of insulin resistance who could eat things regularly like carrots and beets. And then other people can't, right? And the only way to tell is by eating those things and doing those postprandial blood glucose tests to see how you're reacting to those particular foods. I probably put this on another slide that might be coming up, but one thing I wanted to mention is that I mentioned a ketogenic diet, and so that can be a very therapeutic, generally short-term diet for people who have insulin resistance, but it shouldn't be done for people who have any kind of kidney disease, and since kidney disease can be associated with type 2 diabetes, I wanted to mention that. So for glucose self-monitoring, I have a couple of different methods. One, I might have people on day one, they just eat normally, and then they test their blood sugar just 1 hour after eating, and then journal results. Day two, reduce the carbs, then test the blood sugar 1 hour after eating, journal the results. Day three, reduce carbs even more, etc. So basically, you're just reducing carbs, taking those postprandial tests to see what the effects are. Some people are really gung-ho, and they are excited just to ditch the carbs. And so if that's something that they feel like they want to do, they could eliminate carbs entirely, really focus on getting lots of green veggies, healthy sources of fats and proteins. And then they could slowly add, and then they want to test, right? See how their body does with that. Then they could slowly start adding those sources of carbohydrates and see how they do with that postprandial testing. As I mentioned before, some people can have root vegetables and some people can't. Another thing that I've seen with people is that sometimes in the beginning, when they first adopt a low-carb diet, they have to be very strict with the amount of carbs that they do. But as we start to add in things like, as we'll see, exercise and some of these herbs, they can actually have a more varied diet. So sometimes the initial therapeutic diet, I would say oftentimes the initial therapeutic diet can be amended. All right, so tips here, they can be very difficult if somebody's eating a very high carb diet to a low carb diet. So some people will need to taper down slowly. That just jumping in and going low carb suddenly can be tough. So very understanding for people, whatever course they want to take with that. It can take a couple weeks for the body to really adjust to getting different macronutrient ratios. I don't recommend low carb and low fat. That can be really difficult. We need to get our nutrition somewhere, right? And then there I have it. Don't do a really low carb diet if kidney function is compromised. All right, let's talk about a sedentary life, or more specifically, exercise for insulin resistance. So there's a couple of different exercise types that have been widely studied and shown to have benefits for insulin resistance, especially in increasing insulin sensitivity. One of those is high-intensity interval training or burst exercises. Basically, this is exercising at a higher rate for a short period of time, recovering, and then doing it over again. So if somebody is sedentary and they're not used to exercising, I really recommend that they consider getting a fitness coach, at least temporarily, so they can understand how to track this and do it in a safe way. The other kind of exercise is strength training. I recommend using functional exercise with body weights and free weights. CrossFit, kettlebells, all those can be methods of doing this. And again, I recommend, at least in the beginning, doing a personal trainer or signing up with somebody who can help maintain safety and also show them correct form, etc. So here's a study showing how resistance training can improve the insulin sensitivity. You can take a look at that later. And another one looking at how resistance exercise is effective for controlling glucose in individuals with type 2 diabetes. So we definitely know that this works. And depending on the person's age and abilities, they might just start off with walking. But eventually, if they are healthy and capable enough to do these more intensive exercises, there's a lot of benefit there. Other suggestions would just be to avoid long periods of being sedentary. You know, if they work at a desk or have a sedentary job, if they can get up and walk around for 5 minutes every hour at least. They could do things like using an exercise ball for a chair or a standing desk, or, you know, anytime they're sedentary for a long period of time, even if they like to watch TV at night, really stress the importance of getting up and moving every hour at least. Right, sleep debt is something that's interesting because they've shown that even one night of poor sleep can create insulin-resistant cells, which in our society, people are often not getting enough sleep for decades at a time for various reasons, from insomnia and the inability to get sleep to just lack of prioritizing sleep. So that's definitely something I look at. You know, is this person getting enough sleep? Why not? How can we address that? Another thing to look out for is sleep apnea can be a strong underlying cause of insulin resistance. There's that study showing just one sleepless night can cause problems. Stress, of course, is a big one for pretty much every chronic disease that our society is facing today, and I'm sure that all of you listening have many tools for that, so I'm not going to take a long time here. But if someone has a very stressful life and dealing with insulin resistance, we definitely want to address that. All right, phytonutrient deficiency. So I'm going to be talking about very specific herbs for this. But before I got to that, I wanted to just talk about some specific nutrients. And on this slide, I have linked to some studies there that you can look at in terms of these specific nutrients and how they relate to insulin resistance. But these are some of the most important ones I use commonly in my own practice. Omega-3s, I recommend getting fish. I love salmon if that's possible. There's also sardines, herring, magnesium, chromium, vitamin D3, zinc. All of those are either the deficiencies thought to play an underlying role in the insulin resistance, or we just know that people with insulin resistance tend to be low in these, but kind of chicken or the egg thing. But either way, these can be important things to use as supplements for people who have insulin resistance. Gut flora is also a really fascinating thing. I think we could spend an hour just talking about gut flora and how that relates to glucose metabolism and insulin sensitivity, but I just threw up a slide here so you can at least be aware of that and how they've been showing that increasing healthy gut flora can help with glucose metabolism. So when I think about insulin resistance, you know, there's definitely like not one herb for that, right? Or not one pill for it. It's really has all these, you know, multifactorial things going on. And this, I threw up, this is just kind of a make-believe, like how much emphasis I might stress on different things. You know, what is the person's diet, sleep debt, sedentary, et cetera. And so in creating a holistic protocol for people, it includes all of these things. You know, I wouldn't just say, oh, take this herb. It would really be looking at all of these many, many factors. So one word of caution, if you do happen to work with someone who's taking insulin, then they definitely need to be under a doctor's care. The things we're about to discuss can dramatically change their need for insulin, so they need to be under a doctor who can monitor their levels and make sure everything's okay. All right, herbs for insulin resistance. So we can use herbs in a variety of different ways, from increasing insulin sensitivity, lowering blood glucose. As we talked about, inflammation is a main issue with this disease. So we can use herbs that modulate inflammation. And then because people with disease have so much issues with, as we talked about, heart disease, kidney disease, problems with their eyes, we can use herbs to support all of those things. So while we're using diet and exercise and these main pillars of health, we can also be supporting and protecting people. And then lastly, we'll also talk about adaptogen herbs, which are widely beneficial. And we'll talk about how they can be effective and specifically for insulin resistance. Right, herbs that increase insulin sensitivity and decrease blood glucose. So first up is nettle, stinging nettle, it's sometimes called, Urtica dioica. So this is definitely a plant loved by many herbalists, including myself. It is an amazing plant for so many different things, and probably we can owe that to it being so nutrient dense. This is very high in nutrients, sometimes called the highest nutrient plant that we have. It's full of things like magnesium, potassium, phosphorus, and on and on and on. Nettle is great for modulating inflammation. It supports bone health, which is probably due to all those nutrients again. Decreases seasonal allergies, supports reproductive health, supports healthy energy levels. One herbalist, David Hoffman, says to herbalists, when in doubt, choose nettle. He's referencing this idea that there are so many benefits to nettle that if you're unsure of what to do, might as well give nettle. But specifically, when we talk about nettle for insulin resistance, we've seen that it has shown clinically to improve levels of fasting blood glucose and therefore hemoglobin A1C, and also to modulate inflammation. So it has specific qualities for people dealing with insulin resistance. So how you use nettle, so this is what I do for people who have insulin resistance. If I think nettle is going to be a good plant for them, then I like to use it as what's called a nourishing herbal infusion. So you take 30 grams of the dried leaf per day, and you take those 30 grams, if it's finely crumbled leaves, it might be like 2 cups of plant material, put that in a quart jar, fill that quart jar with just boiled water. You let that steep for 4, even 8 hours, and then you strain it off and drink the resulting tea. And the reason why you prepare it like this is because it is so high in vitamins and minerals. Those vitamins and minerals are actually pretty hard to pull out with water, so that using a lot of herbal material and that extended steeping time helps to ensure that. So herbalists often equate this to having like a multivitamin a day, right? Because it's so nutrient dense. So in those studies, there's a couple of studies that have shown that nettle is beneficial for insulin resistance. And in those studies, they actually used a fresh leaf tincture. So what I recommend is that people make those nourishing herbal infusion preparations, and then they stir in 1 to 2 tablespoons of the fresh leaf tincture into that mixture, and then they drink that over the course of a day. You can also eat fresh nettle. Some people know that this is growing ubiquitously around them, and fresh nettle is often it's loved by herbalists, anybody liking to wild forage plants. Again, nutrient dense, it's a springtime plant. And there's so many fun things you can do with it, from turning it into a shake, or that middle photo there is the nourishing herbal infusion. You can simply saute it up with some onions and balsamic vinegar, or make it into a pesto. So lots of delicious ways to enjoy stinging nettle as food too. So some considerations: nettle is very drying, and it has a strong diuretic effect, especially when you first start drinking it. Over time, that seems to stabilize a bit. But because it can be really drying, people might say, oh, well, I started drinking the tea and now I notice I have really dry skin, or they get headaches. So if that happens, you might try drinking less, see if that helps. Or it might not be the herb for you. So that might be a possibility as well. You want to avoid eating the leaves, like the fresh leaves that you see pictured here, if the plant has gone to seed. And this, I can't really get into how to forage and harvest and ID the plant, but I just wanted to mention, since I am speaking about that, you always want to make sure to ID it correctly. All right, our next plant is holy basil, sometimes called tulsi. So holy basil, another plant that has wide-reaching benefits, but specific to insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. We've clinically seen that has a significant lowering of blood glucose, and also has some cardioprotective results in reducing total cholesterol, low-density lipoproteins, and triglycerides. So this one kind of does a dual purpose here of affecting blood glucose and also supporting heart health as well. I really like this one as a tincture, which is taking alcohol extract of the fresh herb. Also, is it makes a really delicious tea that can just be enjoyed every single day. One of my favorite things, one of my favorite combinations is holy basil leaves, hibiscus, and rose petals. Hibiscus is actually another herb that has been shown to have benefits for insulin resistance. It didn't make the presentation though, but except in this short cameo. That's a nice herbal tea combination, but any way you want to enjoy it, holy basil, and it has, again, so many benefits. Cinnamon, our little culinary spice here, is one of the most studied herbs for insulin resistance. It's been shown to lower blood glucose and hemoglobin A1C. It improves cholesterol levels, and it has also been shown to improve metabolic function even in healthy adults. This is, I think I just quoted this right from my book, but there's the study that I'm quoting there. In a randomized placebo-controlled double-blind clinical trial, researchers gave people with poorly controlled type 2 diabetes 2 grams of cinnamon daily for 12 weeks. After 12 weeks, those taking the cinnamon had significantly lower hemoglobin A1C and lower blood pressure. The researchers concluded cinnamon supplementation could be considered as an additional dietary supplement option to regulate blood glucose and blood pressure levels, along with conventional medications. So, and anyway, this is one study amongst many showing the positive benefits of cinnamon. So how I use cinnamon in practice is actually not for long term, but what I do recommend is that if people know, if somebody's on a low carb diet, they're able to maintain that, make nutrient dense choices, you know, day in and day out, but they know something's coming up, like a celebration, a wedding, the holidays, something where they just know they're going to want to have a glass of wine and a piece of cake or whatever that carby thing is for them. Well, they can take cinnamon concurrently with that, and it'll help maintain their blood sugar so they don't see a blood sugar spike. So I don't recommend this as like an everyday approach to maintaining healthy blood sugar levels because there's certainly other pathophysiology that's going on that's not being addressed in this situation. But for short-term use, it can be very beneficial. So that's how I recommend cinnamon to be used in that situation. Fenugreek, another herb that's commonly known in the culinary world, especially in Indian food, and another one that's been shown to significantly reduce fasting blood glucose, triglycerides, and VLDL-C in patients with type 2 diabetes. So this is another herb that could be taken, some studies have shown it to be taken daily, but I actually recommend it for short-term use. There's one animal study out there showing that it might have some negative effects on the thyroid with long-term use, and that has not been confirmed in humans. But I feel like until we know more, I stick with short-term use. So I do it in a similar way to cinnamon, in that I use it for when people want to have a piece of cake or something. They can take it with high-carb meals, and it helps slow down that processing of sugar, so it keeps their blood sugar levels more stable. In the study that we looked at in the previous slide, they actually used 10 grams daily, so it's a pretty significant amount. So Oregon grape and berberine containing herbs. This is probably one of the most exciting things going on in terms of botanicals and insulin resistance. So this has been studied widely, and it's shown that, so berberine, which is a constituent found in many medicinal herbs like Oregon grape, golden seal, coptis, barberry. It's been showing really positive effects for people with insulin resistance, and there's some really cool studies out there showing that not only is it helping to do these things like lower blood glucose, but it's actually showing to be comparable or even better than metformin. So that's pretty amazing. Here's one of those. So comparing metformin and berberine, showing that it worked just as well as the metformin, but that berberine actually had some better effects on lipid metabolism. So, and this is, I just chose one of the studies. There's lots more out there if you want to look more into berberine and insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. So as an herbalist, I definitely prefer the whole plant as opposed to the isolated chemical constituent. So a couple caveats there. We don't have studies showing Oregon grape specifically and the effects that it might have. We just have studies using berberine. But we also know that berberine as an isolated chemical constituent is not readily absorbed by the body. So in some ways, it may be better to have this, well, as an herbalist, I believe it's better to have the whole root. So I recommend Oregon's Wild Harvest with Oregon Grape. I'm not affiliated with Oregon's Wild Harvest, but I have visited their farm and I'm really impressed with what they do there. I like Oregon Grape as a source for this, especially as opposed to, say, golden seal, because Oregon Grape is not an endangered plant in the way that golden seal is. So energetically, it's very cold, and so that it might have some negative effects on digestion, so that's something to look into. Sometimes I pair it with black pepper just to give it a more spicy metabolic effect to it. There's been some studies done with berberine showing that it might affect some liver metabolism and that might affect drug metabolism. So that's something that you might pay attention to if people are taking a lot of medications. So barberry, this is an interesting study that I just happened to come across, and it's looking at barberry fruit. And in certain parts of the country, this is a very ubiquitous plant. But they showed that 2 milligrams of barberry fruit modulated inflammation and regulated blood glucose. And this is kind of typical of berries, but it was interesting to see that this is in barberry. There's a link to that study there. Coffee. So I love to talk about coffee in regards to insulin resistance, because when you're working with somebody with insulin resistance, you may have had to talk them out of one of their favorite food groups, carbohydrates like breads and pastas, right? So it's fun to be able to say, oh, you love coffee? You can keep drinking that. So coffee has been shown to reduce oxidative stress, so modulating inflammation. But specifically, it's also been shown to decrease blood glucose, especially in increasing amounts. So I'd say I wouldn't suggest that somebody keep drinking coffee. Or I wouldn't suggest that somebody start drinking coffee, but if they already are, why not? So there's a link there. So you do need to have a lot of coffee to have the benefits, and sometimes people get anxiety or insomnia before that happens. So that's something to pay attention to. This is a problematic one. I'm not saying that broadly speaking to just go through lots of coffee. All right, prickly pear, and traditional food, and eating large amounts of it, just as a food has been shown to have lots of beneficial effects for insulin resistance. So in certain areas of the country, you can just find this in the grocery store, and that can be another way to address insulin sensitivity. All right, so I'm keeping my eye on the time here, and I'm gonna just speed things up a little bit, but we have to talk about turmeric because it modulates inflammation in such a great way.
Rosalee, I don't want you to worry about time.
Okay, great, thank you. So turmeric modulates inflammation. We know that inflammation is a big problem with insulin resistance. So this is one herb that I commonly recommend when I see these systemic inflammatory conditions like heart disease, eye health, etc. So many benefits. It also stimulates glutathione production, and taking glutathione supplements is kind of a big, cool thing right now in the holistic health world. I just think it's so cool that instead of taking something like an exogenous source of glutathione, you could take something like turmeric, which stimulates your body's own production. Glutathione is really important for many different diseases, but is especially beneficial for immune system detoxification and modulating inflammation. Beautiful turmeric there. When you're looking for turmeric, look for bright orange turmeric. And turmeric is so much fun to add to so many meals, like golden milk, adding it to just your meals, or you could take it as a powder encapsulated. This is showing the different qualities of turmeric. So on the left-hand side, where it's kind of browner and yellower, I would avoid that if possible, and you really want to go for that bright orange stuff. So dosage, we've got 10 grams a day, which I always start low with dosage and then slowly increase up. When you start getting into those higher dosage amounts, you might notice that people have drying effects. I'll talk about that in the next slide. People also take this as a tincture. I just tend to more use the powder, use it encapsulated or food. Of course, there's so many delicious things you can do with turmeric. That's gingered salmon there, golden milk, or a pumpkin seed pâté can really be enjoyed in food every single day. So as I mentioned, if you take larger amounts of it, it can be drying. And what I mean by that is people start taking increasing amounts and they'll say, wow, my mouth just is really dry, or my skin is dry, or they'll have signs of hot flashes, which is a sign of dryness. So if that happens, I recommend backing off a bit. Of course, it stains everything it touches, either yellow or orange. And if you're using larger than culinary amounts, then you want to have caution for people with bleeding disorders, if they know they have gallstones, or during breastfeeding. All right, so I wanted to mention curcumin because a lot of studies out there are talking about curcumin, which is an isolated chemical constituent of turmeric, similar to berberine, to Oregon grape. So lots of really cool studies showing broad benefits of this. And so I have no doubt that there's a time and place for curcumin. I think of it kind of like an impressionist painting. Like if you get really close to an impressionist painting, you can see all these individual brush strokes. But unless you get the whole picture, you're really missing out on a lot. So that's how I feel about turmeric and curcumin. Turmeric is made up of so many different chemical constituents, and I don't think that we fully understand all of them. Maybe we never will. And so to isolate one of those from turmeric and say, this is the healing modality, I think we're missing out on the big picture. Ginger, closely related to turmeric, it reduces fasting blood glucose, hemoglobin A1C, and also modulates inflammation. We use the root, or it's more accurately called a rhizome. You can use 1 to 5 grams of dried, fresh, 3 to 5 grams. Certainly you could use a tincture, but I tend to use this as a powder or as the fresh spice. All right, so far we've talked a lot about common, or some maybe less common to you, but some certainly common to you: cinnamon, ginger, turmeric. We didn't get to talk about rosemary, sage, and garlic, but those are all have shown to have positive effects for insulin resistance, heart health, etc. So in thinking about this, when I was researching my book, which includes a lot of these herbs, it was interesting to me just how many of them had this positive effect on insulin resistance and diabetes. And so it got me thinking, what if we think about these herbs not just as something we use against this disease, but perhaps the fact that this is our standard American diet, where the phytonutrients that we're getting are basically iceberg lettuce, potatoes in the form of French fries, and tomatoes in the form of ketchup, that this is our food instead of this being a big part of our food. Perhaps this is actually an underlying cause of this of the disease process. So we've talked about so many of these spices. They're delicious. I recommend incorporating them into your food every day. All right, so I have just a couple more herbs to talk about here. And I mentioned that heart disease is so prevalent. So it's really important that when we're working with people within this population, that we're helping to support their heart. And what better way to do that than Hawthorn? Hawthorn nourishes and protects the heart. It's used specifically for addressing high blood pressure, optimizing blood cholesterol, but is shown to be broadly beneficial for people diagnosed even with serious forms of heart disease. So this is a couple of studies that I cited in my book looking at people who had stage 2 heart disease and showing that Hawthorn dramatically improved broad cardiac performance. So Hawthorn, I think everyone should know about Hawthorn because heart disease is so prevalent in our society, and certainly for people with insulin resistance as well. Cacao, kind of in the same vein as coffee, right? If we're going to take away all these delicious, lovely carbs, might as well keep some fun treats, and cacao or chocolate is one of them. So chocolate has been specifically shown to have protective qualities for the heart. Of course, there's some caveats there, right? Because the way that we mostly eat chocolate is like milk chocolate with tons of sugar and milk. So we want to avoid all of that. Really, the best way to use chocolate is to make things yourself, so that you can use pure cacao powder with limited amounts of sweetener, if any. Of course, chocolate, kind of like coffee, isn't for everyone. Some people do have negative effects to it. So you just have to listen to your body and know if chocolate's a good source for you in terms of protecting the heart. But again, so delicious in so many different ways, whether it's simply making your own hot chocolate without tons of sugar, making a chocolate cake, chocolate pudding, on and on and on. All right, just a couple of special case herbs. First one is cayenne. Cayenne has many beneficial effects actually for insulin resistance, such as increasing metabolism, also supports heart health, lowers blood glucose, maintains healthy insulin levels. But I put it in the special case herbs because it's specifically been shown to decrease neuropathic pain, which can be a problem for people with advanced forms of type 2 diabetes. So it's using things like cayenne salve topically that can affect that neuropathic pain. And that can be really intense pain. It's really amazing we have such a powerful herb like cayenne that can help address that. It is very hot, so people who use it regularly might find they have some blistering, in which case you just back off the use. And there's some dosage recommendations there, but it is definitely a hot, hot herb. So I mentioned that people with insulin resistance tend to have problems with their kidneys, right? Well, stinging nettle seed, particularly the seed, has been shown to protect the kidneys. This was first discovered by herbalist David Winston, and many herbalists have put this into effect. So if somebody has insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, maybe they could be incorporating nettle seed into their life just as a preventive. And here's a link to 2 case studies from Jonathan Treasure, who used nettle seed for decreased kidney function. So I don't work with decreased kidney function personally. I think the person should be with medical care in this situation, but I would certainly pass along this type of information for that. So eye health can be a big issue for people with insulin resistance. So blueberries, bilberries and blueberries are wonderful for protecting eye health. Blueberries are easier to find, so I recommend eating a half cup a day, as long as people can tolerate that in terms of what their blood glucose does. Typically they can, so a delicious way to support eye health. Right, adaptogenic herbs. These are herbs that are broadly beneficial, and I chose some that are specific to insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. Ashwagandha is really a glowing example here. It does so many things that are related to this disease process, like improving sleep, supporting reproductive health, improving cognition, lowering blood glucose, and improving blood cholesterol. We use the root of it. I typically use the powder myself, and I use anywhere from 5 to 20 grams, depending on the person. Always start low and then slowly increase. Some herbalists really like to use the tincture. I like to put it into foods personally. So, adding it to a smoothie, or this on the right-hand side, these are little date balls, but any kind of nut ball that you can add a powder to can be a delicious way to get ashwagandha. Reishi is a mushroom that has so many benefits for people with type 2 diabetes. This is another one that I highly encourage most people to have. Protects the heart, supports the immune system, has strong anti-cancer potential. It is hypoglycemic and protects the liver. So broadly beneficial to people, of course, a treasured herb in Chinese medicine. We use the whole mushroom, and basically there's 2 ways to use this. You want to decoct the whole mushroom. You can often buy it as slices like this, which is what I recommend. And you want to simmer, by decoction I mean simmering the mushroom for as much as an hour to even overnight in a crock pot. Or you can take a tincture. I'm really partial to Galen's Way. They're a apothecary out of San Sebastopol in California. Not affiliated with them, but they make an amazing reishi tincture. I like to use reishi and dandelion together, so I'll simmer those up. It's just delicious. It's bitter, but it's pretty good as a way to enjoy both those benefits. Right, astragalus, we typically use the root, and it modulates the immune system. It's another, the broad spanning adaptogen. There's another close-up of the root there. So astragalus, broadly supporting, it has anti-cancer potential. It's food-like, so we can cook it into our foods, but when you have it as a root, like you see there, it doesn't become edible, right? It's always fibrous. The dosage here is pretty big, 30 to 100 grams, but you could also use the powder in smoothies, rice, etc. So you always want to make sure you're using the right species of astragalus. It's not to be used when people are on immunosuppressive drugs, and generally not used when you have acute symptoms, like acute cold and flu symptoms is what I mean by that, but it can be taken long-term otherwise. I like to have it as a chai, so many of those herbs that we talked about, like ginger and cinnamon, throwing all those herbal chai spices in with astragalus, decocting that for a while. So delicious. Great way to get your astragalus. All right, so my final thoughts for this, I want to bring it back to that glucose monitor, because that is something I think everybody should have who's dealing with this disease, to monitor that every day, see how their food choices, their movement choices, and the herbs they're taking are affecting their blood glucose. This will vary widely and just give someone a very accurate, objective response to how things are working in their life in terms of their blood sugar. So that's a really good place to start with people. And then we think about those root causes. So we want to, talk to people about how these might be influencing what's going on in their life. Working with someone, their life might look a lot like this, right? Not great nutrient-dense food choices, lots of stress, lots of things going on. And so it might be about having a conversation with them of what choices are they interested in making, or willing, or capable of making, so that their lives can be more filled with energy, potential, and health. Another thing, just to wrap this up, is I think in working with people who have insulin resistance, it can be a conversation of, how is a diet of this kind of, I'm just using these as examples, right, of the standard American diet. How is this supporting our health versus how can we change a diet to be so completely filled with herbs and spices that literally every single meal is like getting medicine and helping to support all of those things that we've been talking about, from insulin sensitivity to nourishing and protecting the heart. Well, thank you so much for following through with all of that with me. I hope that really showed what plants can do. I think it's such an amazing thing that they have so much potential in affecting insulin resistance, and it's a joy to be able to share all of that with you. I do have slides that you can download. I know we're going to do questions now, but I just want to mention that here's the URL that you can download those slides. I made it as small as possible, but because I do lots of slides, it ended up being about 40 megabytes, but you can download that there at herbalremediesdevice.org.
Thank you, Rosalee. I really appreciated the enthusiasm that you presented this with. Oftentimes we'll hear people present that have the research base, but not definitely in clinical practice. So bringing your experience to this really lends some credibility, a lot of credibility, in addition to the fabulous references that you add to each slide. So thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for this. And it was noted very much, the beauty of your slides, also the ladybug that was on the nettle leaf. Yeah, we loved that here.
Oh, thanks. I took that photo in central France. My husband's French, and we were visiting his family, and we were on a volcano in central France. So it's fun whenever I see that photo. I think of that moment.
Good one. Okay, ready for some questions?
Absolutely.
All right. I just want to note first, I think that you're an unusual herbalist in my experience. You're presenting this just not from an herbalist perspective, but from a holistic health perspective. Your ability to understand and bring in the concept of lab tests, and talking about them with your clients, and the depth of your protocol, to not, again, just be herbal, but to bring in diet and lifestyle in it, and the way that you're counseling the people that you see, I think is really a beautiful thing.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, this is definitely the thing I work with the most, and I have personal interest in it. And that, I watched my grandfather die from this disease, and I was young when it happened, and it was a heartbreaking thing to see. And
sure.
So that passion, I think, that comes through and doing this, it really comes from that wanting to help people reverse this disease before it progresses, and what I see as affecting that the most is that kind of holistic protocol that really looks at it on all these different levels.
Sure.
And
And
it's a fun thing to watch people transform their entire life. You know, I generally work with people for 6 months, you know, so I think I wanted to mention that because this isn't something that happens overnight,
Right.
but to watch someone over a period of many months, you know, transform their lives, it's a really just an honor to watch that process.
It is an honor, and you bring up an excellent point about it taking time. You could give your entire protocol to somebody the first time that you see them, and they would likely be extremely overwhelmed and have a hard time implementing it and staying committed to it. And so small, steady changes over time and monitoring somebody. But you brought up a good point in the presentation of with client changes is if they're willing and capable of making them. We can't make anybody do anything. They have to be willing and capable, both of that. And there's a number of factors that play into willing and capable. So appreciate that comment too.
Well, that's definitely come from experience because I have to admit I had a lot of judgment against people who weren't willing to immediately give up all carbs in their life. And that's why I had to come to this spot. I mean, it took me years, honestly, but to realize, okay, if someone's not going to give up all the carbs that they need to, what else can I do for them? You know, that's their choice. It's not my job to be judgmental about it. And so that's where I really came to, okay, let's support their heart. Let's support them with these adaptogen herbs. It's not, you know, if they choose not to do that or if they can't do that, we can still do a lot to support them. So thanks for acknowledging that.
Sure. The question about the glucose meter. What glucose one do you use? Do you have a suggestion for it? And does it even matter?
Yeah, I actually do recommend a specific one, and it's I believe now I'm going to blank on it, but I believe it's the Ultra Mini, and the reason why I used to just tell people like, oh, whatever one you want to get is fine. But then I had people getting some kind of ones I didn't know how they worked, and I don't know, it was just kind of I don't know. So now I recommend this one. It's the One Touch Ultra Mini. And it's just really simple to use. It costs like $20 or less at pharmacies. So that's the one I recommend. Sometimes people already have them, or their insurance is only going to pay for a specific one. But a good tip if working with people is that you can often go to the manufacturer's website or even look on YouTube, and you'll see like tutorials. Like people have tutorials of like how to use this individual glucose meter. So if that's the case, then you can just help support people in how they use that device.
I have a lot of compassion for people that deal with insulin resistance and diabetes for certain, but one of the ways that I'm really compassionate about is that they have to prick their finger all the time. And I'm a big whammy pricking my fingers. I don't have diabetes, so I don't have to do this. But at times, like, please don't, please, I don't want to. It hurts so much. But there was a tip that a practitioner shared with me very recently. She said, "No, don't prick the bottom of the pad of the finger. Prick it on the side." And it's like brilliant, you know. Is because it's such a simple little thing, but it doesn't hurt on the side as much as on the bottom. I don't know if there's less nerves there, but it's also then going through the day, not touching it. We touch on the bottom of our finger all the time and not on the side. So just a little tip from a
That's
practitioner.
An excellent tip. Yeah.
Okay. Another question to you. I want to know that when one of the three main categories of the foods that we eat, carbohydrates, when did it stop including all vegetables and start just being a starch category? Have you noticed that? That suddenly we're not talking about vegetables anymore?
Yeah. Well, that's kind of that's one thing that I've had to come to realize with clients is, as I mentioned, some people can eat root vegetables just fine, and some people can't. And so that's why it had, like I make that separation of leafy green vegetables versus root vegetables. Because if someone can eat beets and carrots and winter squash, then I want them to. Those are such wonderful, nutrient-dense foods. But what I do recommend is that people test to see if they can or not. And as I also said, sometimes they can't initially, but over time they can because they have more insulin sensitivity and they can eat those wholesome foods.
Well, on one of your slides, you really emphasized in the carbohydrate of how not to go low carb, low fat, and how nutrients were important. Do you find that people may be able to do better with the starches, grains, and vegetables if they have a healthy balance of protein and fats on their plate at the same time?
That's very true. Yeah, thank you for mentioning that, because eating 20 grams of carbs on its own is very different. Well, that's a very low amount, but let's say 100 grams of carbs on its own is very different than having a balanced macronutrient. So by that meaning, like just as you said, both proteins, fats, and carbs. So yeah, it's a great point. And that's, again, kind of comes down to that awareness of the glucose meter and checking that. And that can be helpful with snacks. People are like, well, I had the chips or crackers or something as a snack, and that didn't really work out well for me. But that maybe if they have more nutrients within that, like of the proteins and fats, they can do that a lot better.
Yeah, I know. I've plenty of times look at somebody's diet record or journals when they first come in, and you can see just such an imbalance of a lot of refined foods, but just very low protein and fat in it. It's like, well, it's a hard way to start your day.
Yeah,
with some coffee and toast with jam on it.
Yeah, it's so horrible, actually. And a big thing that I actually see is people thinking they're making great choices for themselves by choosing fruit, and especially dried fruit, as snacks or as breakfast. And again, it's that it's not that it's not healthy. It's that it's, if you eat it in an unbalanced way, in a way that's not working for the way you're metabolizing glucose, then that's a problem too. So I've seen that with people like, oh, well, it's an apple, so it's healthy, right? But it's just not working for them right now.
So let's go back to the beginning when you were explaining diabetes and insulin resistance. Can you also explain what diabetes modi is?
Diabetes, what was the second word?
Modi, M-O-D-Y.
I don't know what that is.
Okay, I'll come back to that later. I pulled it up.
Okay.
So let's talk about what's the difference between a low carb diet and a ketogenic diet?
Well, a ketogenic diet is you're consuming so few carbs that you are in a state of ketosis. And so that is more monitored, not just with carb intake, but by monitoring that stage of ketosis. So that's not something I actually use a lot with people. I find that the low carb tends to be just fine, but I know that is a therapeutic diet used by many practitioners, even just as I said, in the short term, as a way of kind of resensitizing the insulin into the cells.
Okay, thank you. Do you have a suggestion for breastfeeding moms that have insulin resistance? This one is saying that she has PCOS, I'm sorry, and have a hard time keeping up enough weight. So it makes you wonder if she'll get enough food while she's breastfeeding.
Well, so I guess I'm kind of confused maybe, but there doesn't have to be a caloric restriction. There can be lots of vegetables and meats being eaten. So it doesn't have to be a caloric deficit that would affect the amount of breast milk. Am I not understanding?
I think that in my experience, it's an issue for many women to keep their calories up, and especially as the baby's growing. The longer the baby's breastfeeding, the more calories the baby needs, and the more calories then the mother needs to be able to ingest to keep up with what she's expending. So I don't know if it lends itself to more than that, is to be able to get the really concentrated nutrients. So add in the herbs and spices into your meals to augment the high density nutrient foods, proteins and fats, and the healthy carbohydrates.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and again, as always, it's kind of like a broken record over here, but the glucose meter can be really helpful too in determining, what's working, but even just how many carbs can be consumed in a good way.
So I'm coming back to diabetes modi here. It's
Okay.
it's a rare form of diabetes which is different from both type 1 and type 2, but it runs strongly in families. It's formed by a mutation or a change in a single gene. And if a parent has this gene mutation, any child they have has a 50% chance of inheriting it. If the child does inherit the mutation, they will generally go on to develop MODY before they're 25, whatever their weight or lifestyle or ethnic group is. Mostly they're under the age of 25 and they have a parent with diabetes, usually with one or more generations. They're not necessarily needing insulin. So, and then there's a few different types of diabetes modi, and I won't get into that now, but just to lend some credence to that question and our ongoing quest for what the heck is going on here with people.
Yeah, thanks for looking that up. So yeah, it sounds like genetics does play a role in just the general insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. And it sounds like in this particular one, it plays like the major role.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you think that Oregon grapefruit or berberine can be taken in addition to standard medications like Jardiance?
And what was that kind of medication? I didn't understand that.
It's a diabetic medicine called Jardiance.
Okay. I don't have experience using that with that particular medication, so it's something that I would look into. Either doing your own research, talking to your doctor about it is what I would recommend. I believe there are studies showing concurrent use of metformin and berberine, so that one has been shown to work well. I don't recommend that people stop taking medication since I'm not a doctor, but I have worked with numerous people who work with me and their doctor and have been able to stop taking metformin because of all of these recommendations. And so they've reversed the process so much that they can, then just approach it from a completely natural point of view.
Mm-hmm. Next question. This is about ashwagandha not being on certain diets. Autoimmune diet I'm aware of, and with ashwagandha being one of my favorite herbs, I'm one, and it's not explained in the literature of why it's discouraged in an autoimmune diet. Do you have any insight on that?
Well, I would say be highly suspect anytime an herb is discouraged without citation or any kind of rationale. I would say that ashwagandha is probably one of the main herbs the herbalist uses for a broad range of autoimmune diseases. So I just have no idea why someone would say that. So I would, but whenever you're approached with that kind of information, it is a good idea to say like, well, what is the rationale? And sometimes we don't have studies, right? Like we don't have a lot of studies about herbs and pregnancy, right? Because that's obviously a ethical dilemma, right? You wouldn't just give 300 women an herb and then 300 women not an herb and then see how it turned out, right? We wouldn't do that. So sometimes we do have to look at traditional use and make decisions like that. But there is a book called The Botanical Safety Handbook, and it's put out by AHPA, AHPA, The Botanical Safety Handbook. It's a huge textbook. Unfortunately, it's fairly pricey, but it is the best source of herbal safety that I know of because they rationalize everything. They give each herb a safety rating and then they tell you like, well, we don't recommend it for this because of this study or whatever the case may be. And so I always want to know the rationale of why an herb wouldn't be recommended.
Okay, thanks. And coming around to astragalus, typically it's something that I have a strong affinity for, and I'll be known to just take one of those strips and put it in my mouth and chew on it like gum. But And another form that I've used it and want to get your feedback on is to take the root strips and boil it and steep it for up to 24 hours and then drink it. Any counterindication with that approach?
No, I think that's an excellent approach. And I don't know that 24 hours is necessary, but half an hour is great to simmer the root. You definitely want to simmer it, not just steep it. And the thing about astragalus is that the Chinese use it in huge dosages, right? Up to 100 grams, which is almost 3 ounces. It's a lot of herb.
Yeah.
So I typically even recommend it around 30 ounces, which is still a lot of the herb. But some people say, like, if they're just going to add a few strips to your soup or something, like we're talking like grams, a couple grams, that could have some little supportive benefits. But if you're taking it therapeutically, taking that 30-gram dosage is going to be really beneficial. And so the way you described it is ideal, I think, for getting that much in. Yeah.
Simmer it first and then steep. For extended amount of time. But I'm an extended kind of steeper, so in general. All right, let's come back to glucometers. Comment is they're so expensive, especially the test strips. And the test strips sometimes require a prescription. So if you're working with a low-income client, do you have any insight on how to get them the supplies they need to be able to take the test daily, or maybe more qualitative way to know where your glucose levels are?
Yeah, unfortunately, there's no subjective way to know what your blood glucose levels are, right? It has to be something that's tested. And it is unfortunate that, like that One Touch Ultra Mini that I recommend, last time I saw it in a pharmacy, it was $16. But it is those test strips. Last time I saw, they were, I think, 30 cents a strip, which if you're testing, 2 to 7 times a day, that adds up pretty quickly. So a couple of things about that. One is that if somebody has blood tests showing that they have insulin resistance, then their doctor will most likely write them a prescription for that. I see that all the time. So that can be one way, if they have health insurance, to go that route and just get that prescription.
Yes.
Another thing is that my experience has been that people have to do a lot of testing, like for the first 2 weeks. And just a lot of testing. How are things working out? Okay, change my diet. Okay, how did that work out? But after a while, people tend to eat kind of the same foods and they know what their blood glucose is going to be. And so after a while, it becomes more of a, once a day to every other day. I think it's important to keep on it. And so, and keep us, keep people honest that if they start to slip up a little bit, then, they could be kind of rerouted back and to making better choices. But so that's all really the only suggestions I have is, one, hopefully get insurance for it, or 2, know that it's not, I don't know anybody that tests that much, every single day, just because people just know what it's going to end up being for the most part.
And not at all meaning to get political here, but if it opens up to be able to get our medical supplies from Canada, it'll make a difference, and otherwise move out of this country where healthcare is affordable to a different rate. Okay, so in terms of setting up a protocol for somebody, do you have a first thing that you generally recommend to somebody with insulin resistance?
First thing, get a glucose meter. Because it really does come to that awareness, because a lot of times, as I mentioned, people come to me, they aren't even aware that they have this process going on. And as I keep saying, it's an objective measure because you can't really feel that your blood glucose is high, at those levels. So that's the first one, awareness. How are my food choices affecting me? And then, it kind of change depending on the person. I think diet is where I'm going to generally put most of my influence or most of my credence behind. But I also kind of suss out people, because sometimes people have a lot of resistance to any kind of dietary changes. So I've learned that to kind of suss that out a little bit, and then maybe not that have be the first major suggestion the first visit, and maybe focus more on movement. And I'm always looking at where that person is in terms of their movement qualities. And then I'll use some of those herbs that have big results, like the cinnamon. They can, if they have their glucose meter, people can pretty instantly see how much cinnamon can affect their blood glucose. Things like the nettle. So whatever I can get, like generally when I work with people at first visit, I want them to go home with something that feels inspiring, doable, and that the results are pretty quickly wow, because I want them to come back. I want them to say like, oh, I could do that. And it was, worked out great for me. And I saw results, and now I can't wait to go back and do the next step.
Yeah.
So I just mentioned it like that because it's not how I started out. I started out giving people the whole darn protocol. Yeah. Like, here's how you have to change your diet in every single way. And here's all the exercise you have to start doing tomorrow. And here's the 20 herbs and nutrients I want you to start taking. And some people will do that and most won't. And I figured that out fairly quickly that if I wanted to have success with clients, I needed to meet them where they were at and give them something doable. So I do accentuate diet a lot, but it also depends on the person, like maybe that person comes to me and their diet actually looks pretty good. And, maybe they have regular movement in their life, but they're super stressed and they aren't sleeping. Then I would focus more on that. How can we, address that in a holistic way? So, and that way it does come down to the person, but I would say most of the time, like if you remember that pie chart that I showed before, that's like diet was really big and movement was really big. Those are definitely tend to be the two biggest ones. And I don't think I mentioned this, but the cool thing about movement, besides having numerous positive effects, improving mood, and so many beneficial effects for overall health, is that people who integrate that high intensity interval training and the resistance exercise typically can also find that they can have more carbs, and so their diet can be more varied. Maybe I did say that, but that's kind of a cool gift for people. It's like they have a very restrictive diet at first. Maybe they can do it for a little while, but it's not always fun. But by really getting into exercise, they're feeling better physically, they're feeling better mentally, and finding that if they exercise regularly, they can have a more varied diet, which I think also helps for the physical, mental health.
I do too. No, thank you for that. And last question, you had brought up sleep apnea on one of the slides, and I'm seeing that being more and more common of a condition, particularly in women. Are you seeing that?
Yeah. And that's another tough one, because in order to get diagnosed with that, I can just have my suspicions, right? If I don't know, like I guess I'm approaching this question as if I don't, they haven't been diagnosed. Yeah. But I suspect it going on. Obviously I'm not going to diagnose them because I don't know, but they have to, in order to do that, you have to get a sleep study, which is very inconvenient and can be very expensive if you don't have insurance. So that's a bummer. And then you have that contraption that, if you do end up having sleep apnea, then you have the contraption that you sleep with, which, really the benefits are so profound that, most people, it's just something that they tolerate because, basically sleep apnea, for people who don't know, it's that people stop breathing at night. And so their blood oxygen levels are falling, and then it affects mental health significantly, besides also being a contributing cause to insulin resistance. So if somebody has sleep apnea and they have been diagnosed, then they should have a sleep apnea machine that they sleep with every night, and that should help mitigate the effects. And the good news is, exercise has a great effect on sleep apnea. And if they're able to even lose a little bit of weight, that can also have a really positive effect on sleep apnea too. So,
do you have herbs that you recommend
for sleep apnea?
Yeah,
I don't. I don't even know if I've ever seen herbal protocols like specifically for sleep apnea. I think my first thing is exercise, which I'm not saying that everybody who has sleep apnea doesn't exercise by any means, but that can be a common denominator with that. So that's where I would start first.
All right. Well, I want to thank you for much. This was a really interesting and really comprehensive presentation, and a very different approach to the discussion of insulin resistance diabetes. So I want to thank you for that. And I've got some closing comments here. Just take another minute or two. I want to remind everybody that this webinar, as rich as it was, I'm glad that it's recorded, and it'll be up on Hawthorn's website under archived webinar in just a few days. So you can review this presentation, and there's a lot of other ones up there too from previous webinars. And if you're interested in learning more about insulin resistance or all things holistic health and nutrition, check out our website and the programs and the courses that we offer. And if you want more personalized attention, Kathy McDermott is our Director of Admissions and is ready and able to talk with you about your curiosities. A reminder that there's a survey to fill out at the end of this webinar to be able to give us your feedback and your comments. And I appreciate you taking the time, and I'll remind you that Rosalee's given a copy of her new book, Alchemy of Herbs, Transforming Everyday Ingredients into Food and Remedies That Heal. It's a terrific book. Fill out the survey. Let us know that you'd like a copy, and you'll be entered in the drawing tomorrow. Our next webinar is Tuesday, May 2nd. Dina Rose is back with us to talk more about feeding kids. This time she's focusing on children who are experiencing eating disorders. So that should be rich and a very important and a very different take on feeding our children. We'll have announcements before that too, so please join me. And lastly, about our All About Alumni presentation that's May 3rd, Wednesday at noon Pacific time. Okay, that concludes today's presentation. I want to thank you again, Rosalee.
No, it's such a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it was our pleasure, absolutely. And thank you to everybody for sharing this experience with us. So I wish you all the best of health. I look forward to learning more again together at our Hawthorn University's webinar and All About Alumni series and everything we do here at Hawthorn. Join us, show up for your life. It matters. All right, take care, everybody.